to talk about is the broad trends that are at work at the university. And when I talk about the university, I don't just mean in Australia, but throughout the Anglo-American world, whether it's in Canada or England, United States, we see a very similar pattern. And the way that I understand the pattern evolving is in three phases. When I went to university in the late 60s and early 70s, the university was a place that was one where people debated in a very hard, robust manner. We argued with each other. We fought each other like almost as if we were in a mortal combat. But everybody understood that it was really important to open up the space for free speech. And everybody understood that risk-taking, experimentation, criticism, questioning was really what a university was all about. And I think at that point in time, and all the way up to the late 70s, when people thought about freedom in relation to the universities, they really did believe that academic freedom and the freedom of speech were really values that were very important, that were fundamental, and that without the foundation of freedom, the life of the university would be fatally compromised, and it would turn into an empty institution with no real purpose to it. So in that first phase in my life, freedom was seen as being pretty much inviolable. It was very much perceived as a first-order foundational value on which everything else within the university rested. By the time you get to the 1990s, something very new occurred, something very troubling developed. And the way that I explained to myself that shift is the way that people regarded freedom. When people talked about freedom in academic circles and in student politics, they increasingly used the expression, "I believe in freedom, but." And what came after the "but" almost invariably negated what the idea of freedom was. In other words, I believe in freedom, but not for those people. Or I believe in freedom, but not if those people express hate. Or I believe in freedom, but not if they offend a particular group of individuals on campus. In other words, freedom became seen as a selective good, something that you could believe in now and again, and for some people, but it wasn't something that was beyond question. And I think that second phase more or less existed until the last 2 or 3 years. In more recent times, we have a very new development on campuses. And that development basically is that when you talk about freedom, a growing section of the campus community, still a minority, but nevertheless an influential minority on the campus community, actually believes that freedom is not a big deal. I mean, what's the fuss? I mean, who cares about freedom? Freedom doesn't put food on the table, they will tell you. You know, freedom doesn't guarantee you a good life. Freedom sometimes makes you feel uncomfortable. And increasingly what you're getting is people saying that when push comes to shove, free speech or academic freedom are not necessarily a good thing, certainly not a good thing, when the freedom of speech is used to criticize certain groups, when certain people feel hurt, when they feel offended, when they feel that their personality has been undermined by the criticism that has been leveled at them. So now what you've got is a situation where in all but name, freedom has become a second-order principle. No longer foundational, a second-order principle. It's become a second-order principle that's subservient to other values. So for example, for many people, freedom is not nearly as important as safety. And safety these days is used in a very wide sense. Safety doesn't just mean physical safety. Increasingly, it means emotional safety. And when it comes to emotional safety, as you and I know, any form of speech can be hurtful. As you know yourself, you go to a party and somebody makes a remark that unwittingly insults you. The person doesn't mean to insult you, but yet you interpret that as a slight on your personality, and you feel hurt. And sometimes people make a joke at your expense. On more than one occasion, people make jokes about my buck teeth, and it hurts. You know, I go away, I look in the mirror, and I kind of tremble and maybe have a mini trauma as a response to this. So words do hurt. We know that. And if we now draw the conclusion that because words can have a negative effect upon us, whether words can demoralize or disorient us, because of that we should now begin to censor the words that we're using, then we do run into trouble. And I think one of the things that has occurred on campuses is that the right to speak freely is now circumscribed by a large number of different interests to say you can speak freely, absolutely freely, on matters that are not all that important. But when it comes to issues that confuse or disorient people, we need to be sensitive. And the number of times I heard people say, we need to be sensitive, is just incredible. And by sensitivity, what they are really saying is that you cannot express what you really believe in. You cannot speak from your heart just in case a group of individuals, or even one single individual, might be offended by that. In other words, what we have is a notion that freedom is far less important than the right of those people not to be offended. And you will hear this statement time and time again. The right to not to be offended is far more important than your right to say something that might be hurtful to that person. Now, there's a problem here. It's a problem particularly for a university, which is that any idea that's worth anything, any idea that makes a difference throughout human history has always hurt somebody. It wouldn't be a good idea if people just simply said, oh yes, and kind of casually went on with their life. It's precisely because good ideas disturb, good ideas confuse. It's precisely for that reason that we have a situation where ideas by themselves are always disorienting. And if we now have this new rule that we should circumscribe these new kind of ideas in this way, then we do run into a lot of trouble. So the big development that has occurred in universities is that the idea of freedom as being harmful has been more or less assimilated and internalized as a fact of life. Freedom is no longer seen as something that opens up the world to us and creates new possibilities. Freedom is also now seen as a source of harm to an individual. Well, why harmful? You know, what makes freedom harmful? Well, we now argue that what makes freedom harmful is the fact that students that come to the university are by and large no longer able to deal with criticism. They can no longer be questioned or challenged because they're essentially what we call vulnerable students. Students are increasingly described as individuals who lack the moral and intellectual resources to deal with criticism. And therefore, the job of universities today is increasingly seen as immunizing people from questioning and criticism, to protect them, to give them safe spaces from harm. When I went to university, basic argument, an undergraduate student was presumed to be a young man or a young woman. These days, an undergraduate is seen as being a biologically mature child. And as a biologically mature child, you deal with those persons in very, very different ways. And all the censorship that we see on campuses are very much linked to that. I just want to kind of go towards conclusion by explaining why this has occurred. Why is it that we now regard young people in this infantilized way? You see, the tragedy is that the reason why these developments have kicked in is not because of some malevolent political forces, some kind of radical movements that have brought this upon the universities. There is no obvious movement that's kind of promoting this, although there are beneficiaries of this. I think in many respects, the reason why young people in universities are treated in such an infantilized way, and they themselves are demanding to be mothered and fathered by campuses, is because we adopted a form of socialization that cultivates the powerlessness of the young. Socialization in Anglo-American societies is no longer about socializing them into the values that their parents and their grandparents were socialized into. It's no longer about teaching them right and wrong, or this is good and this is bad. Increasingly, the method we use for socializing people is by psychologically validating them, by telling them that they're very nice, they're very good, they're very smart, by raising their self-esteem, by continually flattering them in school, by never actually criticizing them, by handing them out hundreds of smiley faces every time they come home from school. And as a result of that, what happens is that as they grow from childhood to teenagehood, they've never been exposed to serious criticism. They've never been told, actually, you really are wrong. This is a disaster. You go back and redo this essay. But instead, people are told, well, good on you. It was a good effort. You know, maybe you can do better. This kind of constant encouragement, which people think that is good. They're actually hoping that by giving people more confidence, young people will become more confident, actually has the opposite effect. The main effect of psychological validation is to unravel people's resilience and unravel their personality. And instead of allowing young people to stand on their 2 feet and take risks and stretch themselves and expose themselves to uncertainty, which is how all of us in this room ever gained a sense of independence, ever gained a certain yearning for freedom, instead of doing that, they arrive on campuses as people who are essentially old children. I don't know if any of you have been to an open day in university in Australia or in England and Canada. When you arrive on open day as a new student, there are more adults there than young people, parents. I mean, these days when you arrive on campus, there are more parents than rats. And sometimes you even have the grandparents coming along to give the parents support, because it is such a big transition. It's such a massive transition that little Johnny and little Mary are making by going into the university. And therefore, you know, you have to be there to give them support. Now, in my days, the idea of your father or your mother being with you when you arrive on campus would have been social death. I mean, everybody went to university precisely to get away from them. That was the whole buzz of going on campus. Now it's a very opposite thing. And not only are the families there to give the children support, in some universities, they actually give what they call transitional counseling, where they get these people to sit down, you know, with the undergraduate, the new undergraduate, and say, you know, Johnny, you're now at a university. This is serious business. You're going to find this unnerving. And they tell them all the horrible things that are going to happen to them. And therefore, it's not surprising that little Johnny and little Mary are expecting to be traumatized every time somebody makes a peep. And once this psychological turn becomes politicized by identity politics, which is what it really is, then you do run into trouble. I want to end up by just explaining one development that's often misunderstood. Identity politics on campuses has got nothing to do with the identity politics of the 70s and the 60s. I mean, those forms of identity politics had their problems. But at least they had some kind of political vision with a capital P. They were almost always wrong, but they were essentially political. The identity politics on campuses today is not about changing the world. It's not about social transformation. It's not about a utopia. The identity politics that we're seeing on our campuses is really all about me. It's my identity. It's a narcissistic form of cultural politics, whereby essentially what we have are individuals who feel that if you criticize them, you're not just criticizing their views, you're undermining their persona. In other words, when you criticize an individual these days, it's never about their ideas, it's about themselves. It's all about me. And for me, the best way of understanding what identity politics is about on campuses is to go on one of their demonstrations. I mean, I'm probably the oldest person in the room, but I still go to their demonstrations just to see what, where the action is and what's going on. And if you go on a protest march these days, or a demonstration these days, what you will find, it's a very wonderful phenomenon for a sociologist like me to see, is everybody on the protest march is taking selfies of themselves. I mean, they're all, this is meant to be a protest march, but, it's all, sort of taking pictures here. Sometimes you get two people here, and everybody's oblivious to the big picture, but it's almost like I've been there, I got the picture, and I can go back home. That's the kind of protest that we have, and that's the form of identity politics that we have in action. And although it's not political with a capital P, it's actually more pernicious than the old identity politics, because it corrodes away the very fiber of who we are as human beings. It downgrades the human persona and tells us that we haven't got the moral resources to deal with risk, to deal with challenge. And most important of all, it tells us that freedom, rather than being a precious asset that we have to live with and continually never take for granted, it tells us that freedom is more of a hassle than a good. And it's for that reason that people like ourselves in this room have got to go out and fight and stand firm and explain to people around us, our neighbors and people in our communities, that freedom isn't just another word, it's something that we have to live 24 hours a day. Thank you.